This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. My guest today is an extra special guest because it's my daughter, Alice Ann Whaley, Dr. Alice Ann Whaley. And she grew up right here in Athens, right?
Right.
Graduated from Athens High School. When was that, Alice?
1981.
1981, so it's a while back. And then Alice went to Stanford University in California, in the Bay Area, which was where I went as a student long ago. I was there from 1948 to 51. And what were your years at Stanford, Alice?
1982 to 1986.
1986, 82 to 86, right. But you finished high school in 1981, so why is there a year missing there?
Well, I was in Denmark for a year. I was on a Rotary Exchange program.
Rotary Exchange program in Denmark, but you weren't in Copenhagen, which is the capital city, right?
No, it was, it's called, I guess in English, it's called Jutland, the mainland. Copenhagen's on an island, but the mainland has a city called Aarhus, which is large by Danish standards, not by American standards. When I was there, it was less than 1 million people, so it wasn't that
Less
big.
than 1 million.
Yeah.
But isn't it the second largest city?
The second largest city.
In Denmark.
But there were only 5 million people, so and 1 million of them lived in the Copenhagen area, so that didn't leave that many, more people for a second largest city.
So did you know Danish when you went to Denmark?
No, I had to learn it, of course. They don't teach it around here.
Yes. So you had a crash course, right?
Indeed.
I remember you writing home something like, the Danish was sort of difficult because, for one thing, you had a course. This was in a high school or post-elementary school, but not in a college, actually, right? Did they have a college?
They gave a brief introduction to everyone before we went into the program. Maybe it was a week long. Very quick introduction. After that, it was sort of sink or swim, although I did take a class at the what's called the People's University. I guess it's sort of like a community college, sort of, and they had Dansk for udlændinge, that is Danish for foreigners. I was the youngest person there, the only American.
The only American and the youngest person, and all these other people learning Danish were
university age or older. There was a refugee from Chile, and I think some Turkish immigrants, and sort of a.
But wasn't Danish your fourth language? Was it your third or fourth language? Of course, you grew up with English. But in high school, you took
French, Spanish, and German.
French, Spanish, and
German. The German was the most helpful for Danish. Danish is kind of like German without cases or consonants.
Probably that makes it a little easier, huh?
The lack of cases is easier. The lack of consonants makes it harder to pronounce.
Well, that's like French, isn't it? I mean, the French.
Well, French has a lot of silent vowels, but Danish is very, it feels like there are no consonants. There aren't hard consonants, so it would be a G instead of a K, and instead of a D, it would be like the TH that's in the. So in other words, all of our consonants are softened into something, one step less. What linguists would say non-aspirated.
Non-aspirated.
Yeah, so a K becomes like a G. If it's written with a K, it's pronounced like a G. If it's written with a D, it's pronounced like the. So more like our TH.
I might add that Alice is somewhat of a linguist, although Danish
Felt like
was
there were no
her fifth
consonants.
language. It was her fifth language, but since then she's added a number of other languages which she does in her research.
Yeah, those are more dead languages.
Dead languages like
Ancient Greek,
ancient
Latin,
Greek and Latin,
some Syriac even. Syriac.
Syriac. Is that the background to modern day Syrian speech?
It was ancient Assyrian. It's a form of ancient Assyrian.
Assyrian.
Aramaic. It's basically the same as Aramaic. You might have
Aramaic.
heard
That's
of
a
Aramaic.
biblical language, right?
Aramaic, because the Assyrians conquered the Middle East in the 7th century BC, it had become the lingua franca in sort of what we'd call the Levant.
The Levant.
So that's why it's often assumed that Jesus must have spoken Aramaic, because Jews in the Palestine in the 1st century were speaking Aramaic, not Hebrew. But they may also, because, of course, of the conquest of Alexander the Great after the 4th century BC, Greek had become the lingua franca of the ruling class.
people.
So a lot of people in the time of Jesus, a lot of Jews, even though they might have spoken Aramaic at home, would have learned Greek because it was a way to communicate with the people who were working for or with.
So I guess you have guessed that Alice is somewhat of a linguist. She's given you the, and of course she's also very interested in the ancient world, the time of Jesus and so on. And in fact, you wrote a doctoral dissertation on Josephus, right? The historian.
Josephus, who wrote in Greek, but
he wrote in Greek, not in Hebrew.
Right, he wrote in Greek, and he also spoke Aramaic. That's clear because he refers to speaking Aramaic to some of his own people in his writings. But his written works are all written in Greek.
Right, but he was a historian at the time that the Jews actually were kicked out of Palestine, right?
Not kicked out. That's a kind of a misunderstanding or an exaggeration. There was a rebellion. So he had gotten involved in the rebellion. There was a military rebellion against Roman rule that began in 66 AD. And in the beginning, he was on the rebel side, trying to get the Romans out. And at some point during the war, he realized that they couldn't win, and he switched sides. And
oh, really?
yeah. Which is why a lot of later Jews in the medieval and early modern period, really before the sort of secularization and integration of Jewish Europeans in the 19th century, before the 19th century, a lot of Jews looked down on Josephus as a traitor.
Because he switched sides.
It was known that he had switched sides, and it was largely Christians who read his writings. So they were very suspicious of Josephus.
Right. Well, it gets complicated.
He switched sides, and he was read by Christians. So we're not particularly interested in his writings. Was the attitude, of course, with the more modern approach to the past, a lot of Jewish people also recognize that his writings are very important for understanding Jewish history as well.
Yes, well, but actually what you wrote about in your dissertation was was the fact that Jesus was mentioned early on by Josephus, right?
Josephus, mentions his brother.
His brother.
Yeah, he mentions that he was killed in about 62 AD in Jerusalem, and he identifies him as James, the brother of Jesus. So that's one mention. There's also another mention that's just about Jesus when he's describing what happened during the time of Pilate, and in the Pontius Pilate's
Pontius Pilate at the end of
when
the
he
life
was
of Jesus.
Ruler
yeah.
of or local ruler of Palestine. And in the 16th century, there became a dispute whether the passage that's simply about Jesus, not the passage about his brother, whether that was authentic or whether it had been added by later Christian writers.
Later Christians.
And so my dissertation was about that dispute largely.
Yeah, right. So you were interested both in the Jews and the Christians and the Romans, you might say, and the fact that they were all together in the time of Josephus, about 90 A.D., or was it earlier?
Well, he was writing. He wrote basically from about 80 A.D. to about 100 A.D. There's three works, three major works. There's also a small autobiography, sometimes considered a separate work, but it actually was appended to the large work. The largest work is this one called Jewish Antiquities, and that's the one that mentions Jesus' brother, and probably also has a small passage simply about Jesus as well.
So, as you can see, Alice has delved into the far distant past, but she came forward because you were looking at the controversy over the centuries, right? I mean,
yeah, the controversy began in the Renaissance period. But then I looked at the ancient evidence as well, because of course the Renaissance writers themselves were looking at the ancient period. And that's kind of typical if you do Renaissance and Reformation history. You have to know something about the ancient literature as well, because those were cultural movements that were about reviving ancient works, new approaches to ancient works.
Right, but that was some time ago when you wrote your dissertation at the University of California, Berkeley.
Yeah, it was published as a book in 2003. So
2003, your book came out.
Years ago. Yeah.
The Controversy Josephinium or something like that?
Josephus on Jesus.
Josephus on Jesus, okay.
The history of the Testimonium Flavianum controversy from ancient time, from antiquity from late antiquity to modern times.
From late antiquity to modern times. How modern are we talking, Alice? Are we talking?
If I had known that the book would end up on Amazon.com, I would have picked a shorter title. But it was the title of my dissertation, which dissertation titles tend to be very academic.
Specific.
They're trying to be precise, so they tend to sound rather overly precise and overly long. Like I say, if I'd known the book might end up on Amazon or something, I would have picked something much shorter. Josephus on Jesus, the history of a controversy. That's what I should have named it, I think.
Well, if you're interested in finding out more about Alice Whaley and the Josephus controversy over time on Amazon, you can check it out. And it was published in 2003, right? Yeah, and it's very specific. I mean, it goes into several ancient writers, right? Who are some of the ancient writers?
The most important is Eusebius of Caesarea. He's the first person to quote the passage. And this is actually very characteristic of his writing and very unusual. I would argue that Eusebius of Caesarea is the most important historian probably after Western historian after Thucydides and until modern times. Yes, because
who of course was ancient, really ancient.
We're talking Western historians. I'm not talking about most important in the world. I'm talking about within the Western historical tradition. Eusebius of Caesarea was arguably the most important historian. In many ways, he was a better historian than Thucydides.
Really?
Although he's much less read nowadays. But when I say important, when you look at his influence, he was read more in the medieval and early modern period than Thucydides was.
Than Thucydides.
Thucydides, because he wrote in Greek, was not known in the West until the Renaissance. So
Like
only,
about 1450,
Yeah.
1500.
the Byzantine writers read him because he wrote in Greek, and they saved his works. But Western Latin Christians didn't read him for almost 1,000 years.
Almost 1,000 years. Thucydides was.
Most Greek writing was not read unless it had been translated in Latin. Between 500 AD and about 1400 AD, most Greek writers of any kind, whether they were Christian or pagan, were not read by Western.
In the Western.
In the West, yeah, unless they had been translated into Latin. If they had been translated into Latin like Eusebius was, now see, Eusebius was read in the West, both in the West and in the East by Byzantine scholars.
Right.
So they were both reading Eusebius. And Eusebius wrote two important historical works. One is the History of the Church, and another is the Chronicle. And the reason why he's in some ways a better historian than Thucydides, although less well known, is that he uses primary sources and he quotes directly from them.
Mm-hmm.
And in many ways, this is a better technique than what Thucydides does, is that he makes up speeches and puts them in the mouths of the actors,
but
the
they're
historical
reasonable speeches,
they're,
right?
Well, this is a problem. I mean, when he describes what people did, that's one thing. That's we can say he's a good source on that. These speeches are more problematic because they were often written that way for rhetorical purposes. In other words, they had more literary polish than was probably. So then you get the question of, did the person actually say this? Well, surely they didn't say it in this way. Whereas Eusebius is quoting from written sources.
Okay.
So then, you don't have the same kind of problem. Did the person actually write this? He's quoting from them.
Yeah.
So you could say, yes, he
Makes a
did write that. So in other words, what historians are doing are using what are called primary sources, hopefully critically, in a rational, intelligent manner.
Yeah.
And Eusebius has the part about using the primary sources better than many other ancient historians, including Thucydides. He actually is using the primary sources directly. We know this because we have them. We can compare that he actually quotes accurately.
Right. On the other hand, Alice, one thing one can say about Thucydides, just like Josephus, is that he was in his time. Thucydides wrote about the Peloponnesian Wars as a person who had participated in the war itself.
Right.
Just like Josephus wrote about what happened to the dispersal of the Jews at a time, he was living at a time when that happened.
Right.
Yeah.
Right,
so
right.
in that sense,
They were observers
of things that they wrote about.
Right.
And that's kind of different when you're an observer of something as when you're only dependent upon sources from the past.
That's true. Well, Eusebius also wrote about his own time. So History of the Church, the last, say, 3 books or so, he's writing about his own times.
And which church? About Constantine. He was writing
he
about
wrote about
Constantine.
And also he wrote a biography of Constantine, which is disliked because by many modern historians, because he portrays Constantine in an overly positive way. But again, the good thing about that work, despite the fact that it's not to our taste with the panegyrics, is that he's again quoting from sources. Direct quotes. And we've even found things like papyri documents that go back to the time, 20 years after he actually, and he's quoting from the same document.
Real primary sources have been found.
Right, and inscriptions. We found like a couple of inscriptions of some of Constantine's.
Okay, so folks, you can downgrade Thucydides in terms of having put speeches in the mouths of the participants in the Peloponnesian War. And you can upgrade Eusebius because he did write about his own times, which were about 300.
Well, you can
80?
upgrade him because he quotes from actual primary sources. He
Yeah.
quotes from real documents rather than making up literary,
Making it up, yeah.
literary,
Okay.
literary concoctions, which are the problem with the speeches is that they're in there partly to show off what a great rhetorician he was.
Yeah, that he could
And that
make
was
good
typical.
speeches.
That was typical. I mean, that Roman, both Latin, Roman, and Greek historical writers would make up speeches. And Josephus does that too. He makes up speeches. I mean, describes actions during the war, and then he'll very unbelievably have himself or a general come out and make this long speech, which is obviously is some kind of a rhetorical device to show off
Okay.
the...
Well, let's talk about Thucydides a little bit more. As I mentioned earlier, we both went to Stanford. And when I was there, every single person had to take the history of Western civilization. And there were like 1,100 in my freshman class. So we were all taking history of Western civilization. And Thucydides was one of the works that we read, because every week we read a different book from the past. And the Peloponnesian Wars was one of the earliest books that we read at Stanford. Now, did you read Thucydides at Stanford?
We did have to read most of it. I don't think we read the whole thing, but we read selections from it.
Right. Well, and there are people nowadays who say that...
You shouldn't read anything written by any ancient Greeks or Romans at all.
Well, I don't know. But some people are saying that despite the fact that Herodotus, who is also probably the most famous Greek historian, he and Thucydides, but he had a lot of stuff that was, about myths.
Yeah. Herodotus is less of a historian per se. It's a little bit more like ethnography.
He's more of an anthropologist. So to
Yeah,
speak.
he has a whole book in which he describes Egyptians and their customs, and then and he knew a little bit about the ancient Assyrians, not very much, and he writes about them. His most kind of accurate, and he has a whole section on the Scythians, who probably were some kind of nomads in Central Asia. So it's almost more like ethnography. But the last couple of books concentrate on the wars between Persians and Greek,
and the
and
Greeks.
that's the most
That's
like
more-
history, and
that's
that's
more or less
more
like
his own
history.
time. So there's a lot less myth in there.
Yeah.
But when he's describing the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Assyrians, and when he's dealing with far away in time or far away in place, like the Scythians, there tends to be a lot of
might be a little different. Yeah.
more mythological type
Well, let's
information or disinformation.
Let's
creeps in.
go a little farther down this linguistic thing and talk about other languages. You learn Greek and Latin and Aramaic in order to deal with the ancients.
Syriac, which is just a form of
Right.
they're dialects of the same
They're
language.
dialects,
Same
okay.
language.
But you learned some other modern languages besides Danish as well, didn't you? What else have you learned in terms of things you can read or speak or whatever?
Well, I learned some. I took some Japanese.
Japanese,
for 2 years,
yes.
but I didn't end up using it very much. I originally was, going to visit a friend. who
There was a
sort of-
thought you might go and visit Noriko Tanaka,
Right. Yeah.
in Japan,
Or her friend Etsuko, right?
or her friend Etsuko, who
Uh-huh.
the year that you were in Denmark, Etsuko was in your room,
Right.
and she was attending Hocking College.
Right.
Right, because she was someone who was known to the Tanakas.
Right.
And actually, Dr. Tanaka only recently passed away, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Enrico sent me a
He
message about that.
he was a veteran of World War II when he fought on the Japanese side, of course, because he was Japanese. So you learned Japanese, but you haven't really used it.
I didn't really use it. not for like speaking or
Well, what other
going
modern,
to Japan.
What other modern languages have you learned?
I learned some Serbo-Croat and some Romanian because I visited Yugoslavia and Romania in 1996.
You visited Yugoslavia and Romania, so
Yeah.
you learned a little bit.
Learned a little bit, yeah.
To get there.
Just sort of get by and that
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Anything else?
Anything else? I learned some Arabic to help me with some, mainly because there are some chronicles that from some of the research I do. Is a couple of there are some sources that are in Arabic. So it's. I mean, historians like myself who do pre-modern history, we don't necessarily learn a language to be able to speak it fluently.
Sure.
It's more to be able to check sources and make sure that the translation is accurate.
So it's more of a reading.
Yeah, it's a tool,
Reading.
so that
okay.
you can, because there are some mistranslations or things that are misunderstood because, it gets translated a particular way. And so it always helps to be able to know the original behind a source that you're maybe using.
And you have gone to Europe several times. In fact, the first time you went to Europe was in 1970.
Uh-huh.
And that was the first time that your dad had a sabbatical from Ohio University, 1970. You remember that? You were in London, southeast London,
Right.
Forest Hill was the nearest railroad station, I think. And you went to, so how old were you at that time?
That was 7.
You were 7, just the age of your daughter, Annie. Annie is with us today. She's sitting there and enjoying the the chair which goes around and around. And maybe that's not such a good idea, but we'll see. Anyway, at least it hasn't come apart. Sometimes they come apart if you go to, remember the piano stool?
Right. An old piano stool that was
We had a piano stool, one of those ancient round ones, and that comes apart if you go if you go
far.
around on
Yeah.
it too far.
Right.
But yeah, and so you were in second grade that year.
Yes, 2nd grade.
Second grade, and Annie will be in second grade coming up, right?
Right.
Yeah. We call her Annie because her name is really Alice Ann with an E. And you're Alice Ann without an E. Why is that?
No, I didn't choose Anne without an E. You did. But then when she was born, I thought, well, let's add an E because then there will be a distinction in case there's a mix-up.
Well, that's why I address many letters to Dr. Alice, because obviously Alice Ann with an E is only 7. Whatever. But, and besides, Ann without an E was the middle name of your grandmother, Whaley, Ethel
Okay.
Ann Rooney Whaley, right?
Yes.
Yes. So that makes a difference. Now, on the other hand, our dear friend that you spent part of one summer with, Mary Ann, she spelled her name with an E on the end, Mary Ann. All one word, like the French lady, Mary Ann, not like the English lady, Mary Ann. So that makes sense. Well, we're talking on a very important day, actually, a very important day to both Alice Annie and Alice Ann, Dr. Alice Ann, because today is the 60th anniversary for my husband Bob Whaley and me. We were married on July 2nd, 1954, in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Right?
Right.
So that's why you're visiting,
That's
actually.
why I'm here. Yes.
Which is really nice that you can be here with us to help us celebrate we're doing the actual celebrating on the 3rd tomorrow, but we thought that, well, there were other things that were going on up at the Unitarian Fellowship building tonight, so we transferred to the 3rd, actually. So that's a big day for your dad and me, 60 years. And the only thing I'm worrying about a little bit about Annie is whether we're hearing her shoes on the air. We might be, because they're kind of loud. Can you hear them?
Can you hear me?
Can you hear the shoes?
It's coming from upstairs. They have an aerobics class.
Oh, that. Yeah, there's also that. We were wondering if you can also hear her.
No, she's too far away.
Oh, okay.
Okay, not a problem.
Okay.
Good. We otherwise might wonder what that clack, clack, clack is.
Right.
Well, and where did you come from, Alice, in order to be here today?
Oh, I came from California. From,
California, still living out there.
Yeah, the Bay Area.
Yeah, you went out in 1982 and you
For college.
never
I
came
never
back.
came back. Oh, dear. Well, the message in the 1980s was that Ohio was not going to be a good place for jobs.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if any of you remember that, but that was certainly the message.
Yeah.
in those
Well, it's
days.
sort of been up and down in Ohio for sure, but one of the big problems is that there are so many historians nowadays. It's hard to get a job for historians, and especially ancient historians like yourself, probably, because there's so much attention to American history. You know, the U.S. since 1492. Of course, there wasn't any U.S. in 1492, but Americans are probably naturally just more interested in American history. As a historian, however, in your background, you must have had a number of American history courses, did you?
Some.
Some.
I had to take California history.
California
It was
history.
required. No, actually, I take that back. I did not have to take it. I had to, other people had to take it, and so I had to grade it or something. Something strange.
They excused you from California history.
I didn't have to take it, no, but people in a lot of majors had to take it, and so I ended up sort of grading for it because.
Well, the history, state history you had to take was Ohio, wasn't it? Surely.
Oh, when I grew up, yeah. You mean as a child? No, I meant that when I was a grad student, sort of finishing up. I remember that I graded papers for California history, which was enormous because it was a requirement for a lot of majors.
So you learned a lot of California history secondhand, right?
Ah, dear. I think that they go about teaching California history wrong in the state of California, as I discovered from not at the college level, at the elementary level.
Oh, really?
From my daughter. Yes, because they start, they in fourth grade, they start with the Spanish, of course, not
The
surprising.
Spanish. Yeah.
But the problem is that they spent so much, they start with the Spanish, and then they've never had any American history. So they don't have any
They don't
history.
have the background.
The first history, this is the problem. The first history that any of the elementary kids get in California is California history. Then they do American history in fifth grade, so a year later. So the problem with this is that when they're doing the California history, they learn about the Spanish, early colonial period, the Spanish, Mexican period, and then all of a sudden they're talking about the gold rush, and my daughter said, "Who are these Americans coming in on the gold rush?"
Americans, who are they?
Because they didn't learn any English, the American colonial history, i.e. the English,
right,
the Atlantic seaboard and the English colonies. That they get a year later. So I think this just confuses children. I think
Kind
they
of
should.
confuses the
I
kid.
think it had a lot to do with. It's not just California chauvinism. That's part of it, but there's also there's this kind of perception. Well, if you learn about the English colonies, you're giving short shrift to Latinos or something like this.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so it has
Yeah, I
it has
see.
to do with some of the modern politics of
Right.
ethnic issues in California. But the problem with this, like I say, is that then they're sort of by trying to emphasize so much that the Spanish and Mexicans ruled California before the Americans do. A lot of people don't even know who the Americans are because there wasn't any American history up until
Well-
this point for the young children.
Well, you
so
know,
it's a kind of a strange.
one of the problems, Alice, with learning history at all in school, at least it was a problem when I was a kid, and I think it often is a problem even now, is that they never get to modern times. You know, you learn a lot about 1492 and the colonial period,
Well, I think that's changed.
but you never get to the 20th century.
Yeah, well, nowadays they actually do not spend a lot of time on the colonial period.
Is that right?
No,
Uh-huh.
neither did the English
Okay.
nor the Spanish. They spent a lot more on.
Time on the 49ers.
Well, there was quite a bit about the gold rush. There was a lot, and then there's a big concern with ethnic minorities. So there was a lot about the Chinese, about
Oh, yeah.
like I say, the Spanish and Mexican background to California. The colonial period kind of got skipped over quickly. Not too
Yeah, well,
sure.
if the Indians had a hard time on the East Coast, I think if anything, they had an even harder time in California. I mean, the Californian Indians were really decimated fast.
Yeah, that's true. But at least we learned in this California history class. Actually, that was one thing that was very different between the college level California history that I mentioned I had to grade for as a grad student, and that's what they're taught in elementary school. The college course really emphasized that it was the gold rush and the Americans coming in who really devastated the Indians, and the mission system wasn't great for the Indians either, but it was not nearly as devastating. And when you read my daughter's textbook, you would not get that impression at all. There's a lot about how bad the missions were, and there's not much about how bad the 49ers were, or the gold rush was for the
gold
Indians.
rush in
So
terms of the
there's some
Indians.
kind of real mismatch in terms of the message that's getting out.
Well, speaking of
there.
the missions, I'd like to mention that when you went to Stanford in 1982, you actually went out there earlier to visit and babysit for a friend of Drew Everett's. Remember that lady?
That's true. It wasn't babysitting; it was house sitting.
House sitting for her. Anyway,
Her children were no longer baby
they
type
were
age.
not. They were not baby eyes.
Yeah, I
but
wasn't
you
really-
you were house sitting.
Yeah,
But
she wasn't
and then
there
when
for a
I
while.
came out, I came to Los Angeles because that was in the Los Angeles area, and you and I
Stopped at several missions on the
stopped
way
at missions on the
from
way
Los Angeles to the Bay
Stanford.
Area. That's
yeah.
right.
And that big one is just down the road from Stanford, about 40 miles, isn't it? That big one that features in the
San Juan Bautista, the one in the Vertigo.
in Vertigo, the one in Vertigo. San Juan Bautista is not very far from Stanford, and that was one of the last ones we went to, I
Right.
think.
Yeah, I think so.
But we saw all kinds. I mean, I remember stopping at a mission that was in the middle of a wheat field or something. I mean,
It may
there
have been
was-
San Miguel.
San Miguel.
It's kind of
Anyway,
in
it
the
was
middle of nowhere.
It was in the
Yeah.
middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
You don't think that even any people even came on Sundays anymore or anything.
Uh-huh.
I'm not sure whether it was even an active church. But there were big ones like Santa Barbara.
I don't think we got there. I wanted to go there, but I think there
I
was
think
some
that
reason
we
couldn't
had that
go.
problem. Remember, we had we were going to go on the train. That's why I think we, in the last minute, made a change of plans because
okay. We
the
rented a
trains
car.
weren't running.
Okay, we rented
That was
a
the
car.
one day in a whole year that the trains weren't running. There was a strike. We had to take the bus, but we stopped in San Luis Obispo,
Oh, okay.
to see my college roommate.
That's right. And then from there,
Flossie.
did we rent a car?
We
right?
rented a
from
car,
San
and that's
Luis
when we
Obispo.
decided, let's go see missions.
Okay.
And anyway, you got to Stanford, and that would have been in September of 1982. So that was a fun trip that you and I took. And the first place I took you at the Stanford campus was choir room.
The choir room.
The choir room at the church. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so you were in the Stanford choir, weren't you?
Yes.
Which was an experience we share.
Yeah,
shall I
that's
say.
true. That's true. Yeah. One of
Because
the
I was in
things
the
that we both
Stanford
did.
choir all the years that I was at Stanford, and you were in the Stanford choir for a long time too. So that was one of our nice memories, I think, of the farm. Why do they call Stanford the farm?
I have no idea. Except there was a farm there at one point.
Yeah, it
And
belonged to the Stanford, 6,000 acres.
Yeah, and it is kind of isolated even now. It's,
Yeah, that's true.
It has a lot of land, sort of undeveloped land.
They
around.
have a long mile drive lined with palm trees, which goes from Palo Alto to the Stanford Quad, the main Stanford Quad,
Right.
right? Did you, just while we're talking about Stanford, I'm curious if you ever had a large lecture class in the upstairs room on History Corner that you could go into from the outside. It had outside steps up into
No.
it. Maybe it had
It
already
doesn't-
been changed
Yeah,
by then.
the History Corner had been renovated. The History Corner part of the quadrangle had been renovated.
Been renovated before that time.
And
That's
so
interesting.
they may have taken that out. I don't remember an outside stairway somehow.
Well, I had a course there from the famous Thomas Barclay, who was an American historian of diplomatic history. And he was a fellow who was well noted for, a lot of people remembered him as their best teacher, their best history teacher there, because he wrote interesting books, and these books were well illustrated, with
Right.
cartoons from the 1880s and that sort of thing,
Right.
But he had very strict rules. You could go up the outside steps. You didn't have to go inside the History Corner to get up to that big lecture room on the second floor. But he absolutely would not let anyone come in late. So no one dared to come into Thomas Barclay's class late because they would be they would be really, really sorry. Now that I'm thinking about it, I bet I'm giving the wrong name. I think Barclay was the political scientist I had, who was very good. And I had his course on the year that the Chinese revolution occurred. I mean, that Mao Zedong actually took
The
over
Communist Revolution.
the Communist Revolution in the late, that would have been in 49, the fall of 1949.
Right.
We were reading these headlines, Chinese Reds reach Shanghai, Chinese Reds, take over 1 million Chinese, go to Formosa, now called Taiwan,
Right.
and all this thing was happening when I was at Stanford. Do you remember any big historical things that were happening when you were at Stanford? It's a pretty long time ago now for
Well,
you.
there was a big deal about Gorbachev. In fact, for my graduation, everyone wanted Gorbachev to come and speak at Stanford. This would have been 1986, and of course that was unrealistic.
1986.
Yeah, he did not come. Needless
No.
to say, it was a little too.
It was the year before he got together with President Reagan, right? I think it was
Instead, they got.
1987.
I hate to sound disappointed, but instead they got Ted Koppel.
They got Ted Koppel. Well, he
I'm
was
sorry.
more up to date,
I'm sorry
probably.
to say I did not go. Maybe because the idea of Gorbachev had seemed like a letdown after that, but
Well, a lot of famous people have visited Stanford over the years, including Queen Elizabeth II.
oh, but did she give a graduation commencement?
Were they still when we were in
This is for the commencement speech. They wanted Gorbachev for the commencement speech, which was
right.
in 1986.
Now, of course, when
unrealistic.
Queen Elizabeth II came, she just came briefly to say hello to Hoover Tower and things like that.
Right.
But
Instead, we had Ted
right.
Koppel at the
And I
commencement.
remember her very well because, after all, she's only 4 or 5 years older than I am. She was a princess during the Second World War. She was a princess old enough to drive trucks, and she did.
Interesting.
Now she's a very old lady, but she was a beautiful, beautiful princess. And they used to end the movies in England with music, God Save the Queen.
Right.
And they would show a picture of her riding her horse side saddle and stuff like that. Were they still doing that when you were? Do you remember if they were still doing that in 1970?
I don't think so. Like in the
I don't
movie
think
theaters?
so.
No, I
Yeah.
don't think so.
They were doing that in 1956 when your dad and I were first in England.
In
We were
movie theaters, they
in
played
movie
the anthem.
theaters.
Okay.
Yeah, at Oxford, where he was a student in 1956, 57, and I was teaching American soldiers at the time. So that was one of the very earliest things in our married life. Now here we are at 60 years. Time passes fast when you're having fun, right? For sure. Well, one of the things I want to do, and something I usually do, is say something from our book called Remember the Ladies, A Woman's Book of Days. And what do they have for July 2nd? Well, it says she lived in Pennsylvania, but I think she also lived in Ohio for a while. Her name was Anna Howard Shaw. And July 2nd in 1919 was when she died. But she was a famous suffragette. Women's suffrage was her big thing. And she became the head of the Suffrage Association, it says, until 1915. During which time she did a terrible job. I don't know. Factionalism hurt the group. Well, that was at the time when there were suffrage proponents who were being much more vocal about it. They were going in marches, that sort of thing. So maybe that's not quite fair to Anna Shaw, but there it goes. Now, today's date is actually July 3rd, and here we have Charlotte Perkins Gilman, a very interesting woman from Connecticut. And we have, Alice and I are both big on genealogy, and so we've found out about our Connecticut ancestors, the Rannies, who lived in Middletown, Connecticut. And Charlotte Perkins Gilman was born in Connecticut in 1860. Now, she was a famous, she didn't press suffrage so much, although I think she believed in it. But she wrote a very important book that is, well, it's a novelette, a long short story, right, called The Yellow Wallpaper. You remember that?
Yeah, I read that, yes,
Right. It was about a woman's descent into madness because she was, after the birth of a baby, I think it was, she was sort of consigned by the doctor to, just stay in bed, don't do anything, don't read, don't do art, don't do anything, but just stay very quiet. And she finally she noticed a pattern on the wallpaper, and she finally, it drove her mad. She thought there was something on the other side. She thought there was a monster or something on the other side. It's called the yellow wallpaper. And I remember reading that when I was a girl. I read it.
You read that in school?
No,
Grade
I
school?
read it in a book that I had that
okay.
my father,
I didn't
Edgar
think they
Diamond,
would.
had.
I didn't think they would assign that in school.
Well,
for
but I
children,
never
or
forgot
even
that
high
story.
school. Maybe
You-
high school.
I
Nowadays. but-
remembered the story because it was so.
Yeah, it's a very striking story. I was surprised. It was very modern. I was surprised it had been written in the Victorian period because.
Right, she wrote it in the
it's-
1890s.
Yeah, it's much more modern sensibilities than a lot of Victorian
Right.
literature written by women is. It's
But she went on. She for a while
very-
she edited a newsletter, and she did everything for the newsletter. She wrote short stories. She wrote nonfiction. She wrote the advertisements. She did the whole thing for years. Charlotte Perkins Gilman was a really interesting woman. She lived for a long time in California, actually, although she was born in Connecticut. I don't know whether it tells here about this. It's mostly about the yellow wallpaper things. It says it was written in 1892, but in 1898 she wrote Women in Economics and became notorious as an expert on feminist issues, you know, how women weren't paid as well as men, and that men were interested in keeping women second-class citizens and all this sort of thing. So she's now known by this George Gilman, is her last name, but Perkins was the name of her first. Her first husband was
Maiden name.
Stetson. So Perkins was her maiden name, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, in Hartford, Connecticut, which is very close to Middletown, where our ancestors came from. Hartford's about 15, 20 miles north on the Connecticut River from there. And Charlotte Perkins Gilman wasn't the only well-known person associated with Hartford, because Mark Twain wound up there. Mark Twain had a house right next door to, I think it was the woman who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, who had lived in Ohio.
Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Harriet Beecher Stowe, the famous author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, was from New England, but
Right.
she lived in Cincinnati for a number of years, and that's where she saw slavery firsthand, because Kentucky was right across the river.
Right.
You know, so. But she wound up in Hartford eventually too. Let's see what else it says about Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Oh, right. She died in 1935, and she committed suicide. She knew that she was dying of cancer, and she saved up some poison stuff so that she could cut it off, her life, when it became too unbearable. So she was a very determined woman, Charlotte Perkins Gilman. So this afternoon, I've been talking with my daughter, Alice Ann, without an E, Whaley, from Pacifica, California. Is there something you'd like to say, Alice, as a final hurrah?
No.
A last hurrah. A last hurrah. But you're going to be seeing some friends here, aren't you?
Yes, Susan Westenbarger is a friend I grew up with. Her daughter is getting married this.
Susan
I think
Westenbarger.
tomorrow. Yeah, her
Tomorrow.
daughter's getting married tomorrow, and
Oh, wonderful.
so there'll be some of her family down.
Yeah,
for
and
the-
some girls that you knew who are
Right.
now middle-aged ladies like
Yes.
yourself.
Indeed.
Since you passed your 50th birthday fairly recently.
Yes,
recently.
my friend's kids, some of them have already gotten married.
Yes,
Hasn't happened to my
yes.
kids yet, but
Right.
one
Although
of these days.
you do
might.
have a son who's
In his-
over 21.
Yeah, he's over 21, so
Yeah.
it might happen.
Who knows? Who knows what's going to happen in life? But I do want to mention again that this is an important day for Robert and Lois Whaley because this is actually our 60th anniversary day. We were married in 1954 on July 2nd at the Episcopal Church on Catherine Street, Catherine and Division Street. And I lived right next to the Episcopal Church there, and I was an Episcopalian in those days, and that's where we were married. And my Uncle Albert Daimel from Toledo, gave me away at the wedding. And I wore the little white straw hat with the wings. You remember that? And I wore that pinkish dress. You
I still have
it.
that, yeah.
Can you still get into it? Just curious. Well, maybe
Barely.
barely, just barely.
Barely. I wore that at my wedding. I
You
could still
wore
wear
your-
it when I was, you know,
Right. When we went out to the
20s,
wedding
in my
dinner, you wore
20s.
that dress.
That's right, yeah.
That was a pretty dress of pink cotton, which had French ribbon trim. Yeah. And maybe your daughter Lana will be able to wear it sometime.
Yeah, maybe she can wear it.
We'll see. Because she's getting to be about that age where she's big enough to wear grown-up type dresses.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. She's the older
She's
sister
quite clear
of
about that.
Alice Annie, the fifth generation Alice in our family. Yeah. I'm looking at Annie right now. She's had a good time with that chair. This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday.